Stefan, thank you so much that you joined me again in this time of turmoil and political instability, not only in Eastern Europe, but in the Middle East. We'll discuss a familiar topic, the Mongol atrocities in medieval times, and how much these atrocities were based on factual evidence and how much it was just part of propaganda and the way to label Mongols as the worst barbarians and the worst conquerors. What do you think about Mongol atrocities?
A complicated topic, complicated historiography. Western scholarship, I can tell you, has been doubtful for many decades that these stories are really true. Ever since, I guess you could say, just from the mid 20th century onward, where this real Mongol scholarship was starting to coalesce from Chinese historians, sinology, then you had Persianists, you had Arabists, and you had some people who studied Mongolia specifically.
Yeah.
And it started to coalesce into a field. Mongol studies was often kind of not really a unified historical field, but as this material was coming together in the 20th century, and you had academic historians talk about it, I've noticed they regularly express skepticism about the Mongol atrocities. Yeah. And same with popular literature. Even if you go on a website online, they often reflect the academic attitude, the Western scholarship attitude that really prevailed in the 1970s, 80s, 90s of doubt about Mongol atrocities. They thought scholars in academic settings often argued just to make the Mongols look bad, or they reflected the medieval imagination.
Yeah.
But if you want to know my opinion, I think a lot of these atrocities actually happened, and I'll explain why.
Yeah. So you think these atrocities actually happened, and they're not just some fairy tale and a dirty imagination of people who were excited about the idea of massive rapes and massive pillaging of conquered cities and conquered areas. So you think that it actually happened?
By and large, it actually happened, in my opinion. And I know this won't make me popular with some people, and I'll never win, some award that some people would covet and want to win for saying this. But I'm going to say what I actually think is true. And when this scholarship was really forming and this Mongol literature was starting to appear, Mongol history, and Mongol history was starting to be taught in the universities. Mm-hmm. 1980s, they didn't have cell phone. Actually, there's always trouble in the world, but the world was more stable, it would appear to these scholars. They had an ivory tower, and it was very easy in that ivory tower to imagine that none of this kind of stuff happens. But in the last 10, 15 years, everyone's got a cell phone camera, and there's a lot of new wars starting up, and they're filming things. And this stuff is not able to be controlled or censored. And so what's happening is, it is censored. They try to control it, but it spreads. And this was already happening from, the Chechen War and whatnot. But now there's just so much footage of what war really means. Yeah. And we can see that it actually oftentimes goes right back to scenes in our own day and age that look a lot like what are described in the medieval chronicles about the
Of course.
Mongols. So it would be a kind of naivety on my part as a historian, and it would be a disservice to anyone reading anything I write if I pretended that I could hold to this 1980s ivory tower naivety. No, we know better now.
Of course.
And one thing you often found in the medieval writings was that people said the Mongols weren't ashamed to commit atrocities. It wasn't a shame to them. It wasn't something they wanted to hide. They wanted to advertise it. They wanted people to know so that terror would be struck into them. This was often described. And we can see in today's world with this proliferation of shocking footage just recorded by bystanders and participants, we can see that actually there are people today still who are not ashamed of their atrocities and not trying to hide them. They want to broadcast them to the whole world. And for the same exact reason as the Mongols. So that's my preliminary to the whole question of Mongol atrocities, that it's not something unique to Mongols to commit atrocities. It's not something unique to the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
This was another calligraphy was really starting up. Okay, well, descendants committed slaughters, but that was the standard of the Middle Ages. We'll always read this like the Mongols did these things, but it was normal in the Middle Ages to commit atrocity. And to a point that is sort of correct, that it was probably a more brutal by and large than now, but it's an important world in China, in Europe, all across Eurasia. They write that the Mongols are unusually brutal, unusually cruel. Yeah. They spare an unusually small amount of people. So people in the Middle Ages weren't saying, "Oh, Chinggis Khan, he killed everyone in the city, but that's totally normal for our time." They're not writing things like that. They're saying the Mongol level of total war is another level above what we're used to. And you frequently see this, that the Mongols wage war in a more destructive way than the people in the regions, in these different regions, are used to. They haven't experienced anything like this. It's on another plane. Yeah. And so I don't like that naive explanation as well. I don't like the explanation of Mongol atrocities as, well, that was the standard of the 1200s, because that's not what people in the 1200s are saying. They're saying the Mongols are not following the standards
Yeah.
that they expect.
So the conduct of war were a bit different than what was a norm in Eurasia, in medieval Europe, in medieval Central Asia, in medieval Middle East. What were the most notorious atrocities committed by Mongol armies during these campaigns?
Well, one of the most controversial topics that comes up in different primary sources, and it's one of the things that scholars doubt the most, is any kind of account of cannibalism.
Yes, absolutely.
Because some people were saying that the Mongols engage in cannibalism, and oftentimes Europeans said this. And of course, the Europeans were influenced by, the European literature is doubted very much by Western scholars whenever they're talking about the Mongols, especially in the 1980s. Scholars doubted anything the Europeans said about the Mongols. And in those post-World War II decades, there was a lot of doubt, skepticism, and especially this cannibalism thing was doubted. But there's some nuances that I think we should consider with the cannibalism issue. One is that it wasn't often described as being something the Mongols regularly did. So, for instance, Simon of St. Quentin said that the Mongols just do it rarely. And John of Plano Carpini said, a Franciscan friar who visited the Mongols, said they did it out of necessity. You know, if it really was a desperate situation and they were out of food, like at a certain siege in China,
Yeah.
they ate every 10th man. I don't know if this actually happened, but
Yeah.
so people generally speaking didn't say the Mongols just ate people all the time. They
Yeah.
said if they ate people, there was a special reason.
Yeah, just in time of need
Time of need, and once in a while
and food
they would,
scarcity.
yeah, that was often the case. And sometimes they would eat a really particularly hated enemy. So if it was a really, they wanted to make an example of this
Yeah.
person, like an enemy leader, they might do that. But it wasn't like a prescribed thing. It wasn't something they even seemed to. It wasn't like something that they regularly did. But
Yeah.
another thing about the cannibalism is that the enemies of the Mongols are also recorded in the 1200s as resorting to cannibalism. Like the people they attacked would become cannibals because of famine.
Of course.
So in Hungary, widespread cannibalism by the Hungarian people is recorded in many sources from the 1200s, that they even sold, and chronicles right from the time these events happened would say that people would sell human meat in the market after the Mongols left, openly in the public, because hunger was so widespread,
Yeah.
that the only way to survive. And there were many sad stories about parents eating their own children in this time. And these are Europeans talking about their fellow Christians, and they're saying, yes, they ate each other. But this is also described in the Middle East. Let me see. I have a important. I mean, there's accounts of cannibalism in the Middle East as well, in the aftermath, including by pro-Mongol writers. I think at one point resorts to explain that people were reduced to cannibalism.
Yeah, we're talking
So
about 13th century invasion and fall of Baghdad in 1258.
yeah, events like that. And in China, a pro-Jin dynasty, Wang Yi, was in the city of Kaifeng, the capital of the Jin Empire, as it was falling to the Mongols. And he wrote a sort of diary of the fall of the city as a person inside the city. And he said that gangs of Chinese people would kidnap other citizens in the town. They would just be walking down the street, and someone would disappear. And what happened was they kidnapped people and ate them. So the Mongols' enemies, the Mongols' enemies themselves are admitting to their own fellow countrymen,
of course,
resorting to cannibalism.
I mean, we
So
know very well
if
that
the
Chinese
Mongols,
have
if the
all kinds
seminary,
of strange cuisine and strange recipes.
got,
I'll send you the link now, because
you can think they resorted to eating pretty much anything.
yeah. No, I'm going to send you the link because this one
Okay.
expired. I'll send you the link very soon.
Yeah.
So we started talking about accusations by medieval scribes that Mongols, in certain circumstances, practiced cannibalism, and they were particularly brutal during their campaigns.
Yes. And the problem, there's two problems for a historian who wants to say these stories aren't true. One, these stories are very widespread about the cannibalism, and they cross boundaries of if the author was hostile to the Mongols or actually on the Mongol side. And favorable to the Mongols, they still might report cannibalism. Marco Polo actually liked Kublai Khan. He was close to him, if you believe his story. He thought highly of the Mongols. He got to know them, got to know their language, lived with them. He still said that the shamans in Shangdu, in Xanadu, the Kublai's what summer capital,
Yeah.
up in near Mongolia, that the shamans there ate human flesh, he said, but they wouldn't eat sick people. If the body came from a diseased person, they wouldn't eat
Yeah.
it. So that's a strange thing to say if he's just making it up. But also Ibn,
So
let me
they
just
so they ate healthy.
they also well, the Egyptian historian Al Fadail, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right.
Yeah.
He was a
Yeah.
Mameluke physician. He personally saw human flesh being sold in Egypt after an epidemic. So this is during the Mongol, the Ilkhanate Mamluk wars. He
Yeah.
personally saw in his own country flesh being sold. So literally, we're in a position now as historians where we have to say everybody else was a cannibal except the Mongols.
Yeah.
Or we
Yeah.
can say, so, you know,
That's pretty repulsive, I would say.
and there's a last thing, archaeological findings have added to this story. In Hungary, they have found, archaeologists have found recently at sites of the Mongol invasion, 1200 sites, they have seen bones that show the signs of cannibalism. They've
Okay.
been cut through, and often they're young people, or they show the flaying marks on the bones. Two archaeologists, Gyucha and Sabolch Rasta, are finding a lot of these things. And these are people that they think were not eaten by the Mongols, they were eaten by their fellow Hungarians in the famine.
Of course.
So that confirms those stories. But the Hungarians who were attacked by the Mongols said they also sometimes ate people. And I don't see why we should believe only the Hungarians ate people during the Mongol invasion, but the Mongols, no, they didn't eat people, even though, according to everybody, the Mongols were very unselective. They would eat anything necessary to keep them alive. So, to get to a really sensational story, there's a story told by a Frenchman, Ivo of Narbonne.
Yeah.
This very controversial recorded letter in the 1240s. He said he was in Austria. He was in some city called Neustadt, and the Mongols attacked, and they were eating the breasts. They were cutting off the breasts of women, and apparently giving them to their chieftains. And the chieftains thought these were delicacies. And of course, modern authors in the 20th century and 21st century look at that, scholars, and they say, no way, this is absurd. They cut off the
Yeah.
breasts of women. This is just this is like a
Sick
horror
fantasy.
movie.
Yeah, yeah.
Thick fantasy. It really does sound like one until you realize, well, that person was in Austria, Ivo of Narbonne, and he recorded the breast cutting. But a official historian in China during the Yuan dynasty and Ming dynasty named Gao Qi described the Mongol siege of a city in southern China called Changzhou in 1275. And he says they cut off the breasts of women. And there was a specific reason.
Yeah.
They melted the fat down and turned it into a kind of napalm, human fat napalm,
Okay.
which they then put into sort of gutter pipes and launched over the city of Changzhou as an incendiary flamethrower.
Yeah.
And that same practice, not with the breasts, but with human fat, is described by John of Plano Carpini, the Franciscan emissary. So this kind of human fat cannon was used on the Russian cities to light them on fire. So how are Gao Qi and Ivo of Narbonne in Austria and a guy in China and John of Plano Carpini in
Yeah.
Eastern
Came with the same
Europe, and
story. They came with the same story.
yeah. So what's more likely, that it's a true story, or that there's some wild conspiracy being shared between Eastern China and Austria over the centuries? I would say it's more likely that it's just a true story, that this was a common military practice of the Mongols, or one that they used enough times that it shows up on one side of Asia and on the very opposite end of the continent.
If we know,
Um,
if we know, I would say for sure that during the siege of Kaffa in Crimea that we mentioned last time, they used corpses of fellow Mongols infected by bubonic plague in order to cause the biological warfare. Why would we think that using human fat for 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 projectiles and for warfare would be some exaggeration? Of course, they probably have knowledge of different technologies and the way to use human human body and diseases in order to push their agenda and to push their campaign. They didn't. They used all means to capture the city at that
exactly.
time.
And that reminds me, Gao Qi, this guy, this official historiographer of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty,
Yeah,
describing that same siege of Changzhou in 1275, he says that the Mongols, besides cutting the breasts off and making the human fat napalm, they also built a ramp that was going up to the wall of the city. And the ramp had rocks in it, dirt, but he says they used dead bodies as building material.
yeah,
Now, that's 1275 in southern China, but Ibn al-Athir in around 1230, who's Syrian, and he was in Damascus or Aleppo, so he had fled to Syria. He's writing a very early account of the Mongol invasion. And Ibn al-Athir says that at the siege of Shamaki in Georgia, the Mongols built a ramp up to the city wall, and they included dead bodies of people as a building material. And the ramp went right up to the wall. It's the exact same tactic described by Gao Qi in China, and he's an official historiographer of the government. And Ibn al-Athir, who was hostile to the Mongols and was just describing the very start of the invasions in the 1220s of Persia, and the Khorasan Empire. So again, how come were Ibn al-Athir and Gao Qi sharing notes on Mongol atrocities, or are they just describing a common practice of the Mongols? I think it requires a big leap of faith to believe that this is just somehow all the figment of medieval writers' imaginations and not actually real events they're describing. Because why do they match? It doesn't make sense. And the matching descriptions cross the boundaries of loyalty to the Mongols or hostility to the Mongols. Even a pro-Mongol writer will describe atrocities that match the hostile writers. And they didn't just do these atrocities. The Mongols didn't just do atrocities for no reason. They had a reason, military reasons. And one of those things was treasure finding. So, what are their names? Sorry, one sec.
yeah. Please go ahead.
I think it's Ibn al-Athir, who I just
Yeah,
mentioned,
even though it's there. Yeah,
Iraqi Syrian
of
writer,
course.
and al-Nuwari, who is, I think, writing for the Mamluks. They
Yeah,
both say the Mongols tortured people in Bukhara with Chinggis Khan present to find out where the people were hiding treasure. Because, of course, when the Mongols are coming, people bury their valuables. It's
of course.
almost like a natural instinct to bury a pot of treasure. They find pots of treasure all over Hungary still today, full of silver coins dated around 1240, these are people's valuables, and they were going to come back and get them after the Mongols left or whatever, but they never came back and got them, either because they died or they left the country. And so they find them all the time. And this people hide their treasure, not just in Europe, in all across Asia when the Mongols come. So the Mongols used torture systematically already under Chinggis Khan. And the reason was, if you say put people over a fire and a light fire, you could get them to say if they'd hidden treasure or not. So this is described in Hungary, it's described in Armenia, it's described in Persia. I could go on and on. They didn't believe people who said, "Oh, I have no valuables," or "Oh, you have everything now." The Mongols say, "No, there must be more treasure in the city," and so they'd use torture to get people to say where the valuables are hidden, and it actually worked often. People would admit where they were hiding things, and in some cases, a bunch of treasure was hidden in a well, and a Mongol child found it. This was in the Middle East somewhere. So they weren't always. It wasn't just out of pure cruelty that was driving them to resort to these things. It was often for a strategic military purpose that they would use torture, either to make the enemy give up without fighting. So, for instance, the Changzhou massacre in 1275 that I keep bringing up, the Mongols didn't do many massacres like that during their conquest of the Song dynasty in the 1270s. I think they only did one other one. All the other cities they tried to gain peacefully. And when they surrendered, they didn't massacre. But Kublai Khan made a couple examples, and his general Bayan made a couple examples of some cities that rebelled to just show the rest of China what would happen if you
they
decide to resist. Yeah. So it was a demonstration of cruelty and atrocities that would create horror in the widespread Song population, so that they would give up without fighting. And it actually basically worked. The Song capital surrendered without a fight, essentially. Although many loyalists then continued the war in southern China for like years after. But it essentially this demonstration of the capacity of the Mongols to commit atrocities was used as a military weapon to make others who heard about it give up without fighting. That's why
it was a kind of psychological warfare.
Totally, yeah.
So, what do we know about Mongol atrocities in Europe?
So I had the honor and good luck to be in Hungary this summer, and I went to a monastery, ruins of a 1200s monastery at a site called Bugac, which is in just the middle of the Great Hungarian Plain, so a big flat plain. And I got to see firsthand from their ruins what Hungarians kind of went through.
Yeah.
And why this scene might matter is because the destruction of Bugac is not mentioned in any surviving medieval source. We have no story of this battle except the ruins that tell a story. Mm-hmm. And what the ruins show. So this was a nice monastery. It was quite big, built out of stone, had a big church in the middle, and walls and whatnot, different buildings. And what had happened was the Mongols seemed to have been coming. They were coming from the east, and they were moving on this monastery, and it had a spread out town located close to it. And this was normal. A monastery would be kind of on the outskirts of a town. And in the monastery, the people had dug an emergency trench around the actual monastery building. And they were in such a rush that they were digging right through a graveyard. They had a churchyard full of graves, maybe from people in the 1100s, early 1200s, but they didn't have time to care about the sacredness of the graveyard. They were digging right through it. Very deep trench, it seemed to me. and very kind of narrow and deep. And then in the town, there had been a battle between the Hungarians and the coming Mongols, and there were smashed mace heads, like the mace. This is a common Eastern weapon at the time.
Oh yeah, of course.
Many broken mace heads just scattered all through the town, and there had been even 6 kids or so, or teenagers, juveniles, as archaeologists might call them. They were like teenagers, 12 to 18 kind of ages, and they'd been just put against a ditch and killed systematically and dropped into the ditch. And then a dog had been hit in the head with a sword. You could tell it was a scimitar cut. There's a kind of a forensics to archaeology. So maybe the dog was going ballistic. It was a town, someone in the town owned the dog, and some Mongol just dispatched it. And then they managed to get into the monastery. They got over the ditch, and it's total destruction in the church. There's a very fancy Byzantine mosaic sort of circular relic that was Byzantine, like enamel. It was assembled together, showing angels and this and that. And someone had lifted it and just thrown it on the ground, and it had smashed into pieces. But now they've reconstructed exactly how it looks. So you can literally, the vandalism is frozen in time. And a Bible with glass on it and different artwork just smashed to pieces. Everyone in there was obviously massacred. And then the Mongols occupied it for some time, and there was human remains and there were animal remains just piled into that ditch. So they're eating quite well, animals, local animals, and they're just throwing the bones in the ditch. And then they left at some point, and it was completely ruined and just stayed there as a ruin. But the artifacts are scattered all over, of just a sign of mayhem and pillaging and massacre and fighting with maces and arrowheads. And now that battle is not recorded, as I said, in any primary sources, but in many primary sources, they often describe the desecration of the churches by the Mongols. They said they would take the holy relics and smash them, and they would take the graves of the saints and dump the bones out, and then use the grave as a manger for their animals to feed. And all of that stuff at Bugat, you could see all these so-called tropes, these cliches about the Mongol invasion. We're right there, frozen in time. And it was definitely a brutal massacre. And you saw the panic of that last moment, that last stand of the monastery. You saw the vandalism, the ripping apart of crucifix relics and Bibles smashed to bits, fire on all the goods that had just sat there. They were burning everything. And it was just like no one wrote about that specific place, but oftentimes you have letters from the time that say they just destroy monasteries. They kill all the monks. They burn them in the church. They lamented about that. They kill the friars and burn them. They often say they burn them. The commoners and the priests get burned together. And you had the evidence of that. And that's just one place. And what I'd like to say is that, yes, the 1200s were a brutal time. They were probably more brutal than now. And human history, sadly, is full of atrocities, and the Mongols were not the only people to commit atrocities. But to say that this didn't happen goes against archaeological evidence, goes against this sort of thinking, this way of thinking about how would a Chinese and a Persian and a Arabic and a Austrian source, how would they have the same details about the Mongols if this was not something that the Mongols did? Is it a big it goes to like a conspiracy theory to say that the Mongols did not commit atrocities. I don't want to single them out as the only people in the 1200s and the Middle Ages who committed atrocities, because atrocities will be committed through all of history. You know, they happen all the time. But I would say that the evidence supports this story of atrocity. it's undeniable. Unless someone just doesn't like that, they just go, I don't like that, so I choose not to believe it. But the better evidence says the atrocities must have happened.
Of course. Do you want to add something, additional, or you want to mention some other examples of atrocities, like in Persia or in the famous
I'll
battle?
mention.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'll mention that I've heard it widely said that Genghis Khan banned torture. This is in like popular literature on the internet. You might come across this line: Genghis Khan banned torture, but I don't think he did. Um, it's very tough to like. It's very tough to conquer the world and impose your will on all these countries that didn't have a Mongol government without force. It's almost unimaginable. So I'll just cite a couple examples. Like I said, they would torture people to find out where treasure was hidden. But Grigor of Akhants, who was in Armenia, said that torture during interrogation with heavy blows was the Tatar custom. During questioning, they hit people. But Rashid ad-Din, who was pro-Mongolian, also says they used what is it, a bastonado? This is sort of whipping people's feet during, bastonado. So hitting the soles of the feet during interrogations
During
was
torture, of course.
Yeah, this torture is used today.
It's a police technique of torturing people. Usually
it's
they
used
beat
all
people. Yeah, exactly. And in modern times, they also do the same thing with suspects by hitting them on their soles with a club.
And Juvaini, who was a governor of Baghdad on behalf of the Mongols, said, quote, "It was the Mongol custom to strip someone and beat them with drumsticks to get them to confess." Simon of St. Quentin says the Mongols proposed to send the friars through their army, beating them with sticks. William of Rubruck was in Mongolia, and he said a woman who was accused of witchcraft was driven around being beaten by sticks. I mean, how many different people have to say it from how many different angles before we just go,
different parts of Eurasia. I mean, they have a technique. They also have a technique to put. I'm talking about the modern time torture. They would put a bulletproof vest on the body of suspects, and they would beat him up with clubs and baseball bats, so no marks will be visible, no volts, but he would have internal bleedings. The suspect would suffer from internal bleedings, although he wouldn't have visible injuries on his skin or his outer parts of body. This is the modern technique.
They used green saplings, according to one of these sources. And they would burn people oftentimes, which was kind of a cruel punishment. Yeah. But all of these things are things that we know even right today are happening in the world. And so I don't want to single the Mongols out and say the world was a great Garden of Eden and only the Mongols are cruel and only they did this. Not at all. This stuff is happening right now in the world. Horrible techniques, and in Bulgaria, and I don't want to pick on Bulgaria either, but they had torture chambers, and in the Soviet era, in the socialist era, and they used a lot of techniques that will show up in your Mongol primary sources, and that was a small country. So if you can barely control a small country only by this force, how can we imagine Genghis Khan controlled most of Eurasia without resorting to any kind of torture?
Torture.
It's utterly absurd.
Absolutely.
Like if you know broad world history, to imagine that only the Mongol Empire didn't commit atrocities and didn't
Oh,
use torture.
I even read some historical books on torture, and they would claim that torture techniques began in the medieval period, which is nonsense. They started torturing people long before the medieval period. As long as we have humanity, and as long as we have different states and different political systems, these systems implemented tortures on individuals and the whole group. So I
Totally
disagree
agree
with
with
that
you.
notion. It's the same thing as people would say that genocide started in 20th century or 19th century. This
Yeah.
is nonsense. We know very well that in ancient times, in antique times, whole cities were put to sword.
Yep.
Children,
It only reflects
children
the lack of.
until elders age 105. So all of them were put to sword, and it's a typical example of genocide. It's a school book genocide. When you
Yep.
indiscriminately torture and kill mass of people regardless of their age, gender, and position, stratification position within the society. So yes, please continue.
I can I can say, yeah, that the medieval European writers often complained about the Mongols. So of course everyone is capable of atrocities all through the ages, as you said. One thing they really didn't like was that the Mongols didn't spare the very young. They said they often don't spare the children,
Yeah,
and that was shocking to them. And they don't spare the very old, and that was shocking. And I think a lot of societies in the Middle Ages were surprised that the Mongols would even kill the children sometimes. So that was one thing where they kind of crossed the line. But as a allowance, an apologia for the Mongols, I'll say this: that Richard the Lionheart famously committed a wholesale massacre at least one place. In Jerusalem in 1099, when it fell, there was a big massacre when the Crusaders took it. So, in a way, people often judge the Mongols more harshly for things that might be in their own history because they lost to the Mongols. So they say, when they lose, they say, oh, those Mongols are so cruel, but they might have done the same thing if they were the victors. So I will say that. And the Mongols were very successful in the first half of the 1200s. They were unstoppable. So a lot of people would, when they're defeated by them, would say the Mongols are cruel. And that was sort of their weapon, their judgment to go to the Pope to send Franciscan friars to Mongolia and say, you cruelly slaughtered people, which they did. But cruel slaughters were also occurring in the Levant at that time. So
these were conducts of the war in 1200s. We didn't have NGOs. We didn't have the concept of human rights, which is also a new concept. The concept of human rights is only a few decades old. President Jimmy Carter promoted human rights in late 1970s, and we know very well what happened in World War II and how many millions were shifted left and right, and how many millions were killed in 2-3 years. Actually, people who were main protagonists of World War II were much more brutal and much more efficient than Mongols, which also
and a
does
free press
affect.
and the Red Cross, the free press and the Red Cross, these are 19th century
Exactly.
things. They would just leave the dead. Even in the Napoleon's invasion of Russia, it was a horrific scene. They just left the dead and wounded or the dying and the wounded, they were just abandoned.
Yeah.
So yeah, like and nowadays we have press and we have the Red Cross, and still we can see atrocities in our own time still happen and committed by both sides. And so story of human history is far from over. I really, really fundamentally reject that optimistic, sanguine quote by Francis Fukuyama that this is the end of history in 1991 or
Yeah.
so. He said, no, and history comes concomitant with history is atrocities and tragedy and war. So
We can finish with the tragedy and wish that upcoming days and weeks will be more peaceful. Of course, I'm not very optimistic about that scenario, but let's hope. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll discuss other topics related to Mongols, and not only Mongols. We can discuss the history of kingdoms and empires that dealt with Mongols during that period.
sounds good.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Thanks. You.
Bye bye.